come further in, I feel like I'm teaching. If you can't hear clearly, please feel free to speak up. My name is Kirsten Anderson, and I'm so excited to welcome Victoria Law to Scotland. We have been working to get her across the ocean for some time, and I know that lots of people were excited to see that she's here. So thank you so much for coming. If you don't know about Victoria's work, she's been doing work with people in custody and on behalf of people in custody for over 20 years. She has a number of publications, some of which you see right here in this table. Prisons Make Us Safer and 20 Other Myths, and then also Prison by Any Other Name. Both of them excellent texts. And she also, she's a journalist, and she has written in the New York Times, lots of different publications. I memorized the list. We're just so excited to have her and to hear about her work. And she's been in Scotland since Friday, and just working with different people, going to a couple of establishments that she's here as well. So we're very excited to welcome you to Victoria Law.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me. If you cannot hear me, come closer or raise your hand. If you're having a hard time with my New York accent, tell me to slow down, and I will do my best to slow down and enunciate. So I figure the accent, carriers may go both ways. And if I look like I'm squinting at you, it's because I probably need it. So thank you for having me. I am honored to be here. Thank you. Those of you who have been in the workshop all day and stayed, and those of you who are just joining us. Because I am in Scotland, because I understand that there's the prison at Barley, that's pronunciation, that is supposed to be closed down, and another prison built with the same size and beds and everything else. I wanted to start us off with a cautionary, a victory turned cautionary tale in the U.S. from just the pandemic. In mid-May of 2019, the city government of Atlanta, Georgia, announced that they would approve a resolution that would close the Atlanta City Jail. The Atlanta City Jail is a 17-story jail. So imagine 17 stories that is just jail. And it was built specifically to jail homeless people and people who might be seen as undesirable during the 1960s. So it was made to pretty up the city for the tourists and the campers. And then it remained open ever since, and was used primarily for people who were arrested and being held for misdemeanors. So in the United States, you can either have a misdemeanor or a felony. Misdemeanors are things like you were peeing on the street, you were walking in the roadway, you stole something small, or migrants were being held by immigration authorities for the majority of the people who were detained for misdemeanors were Black people, and they were again detained for these minor acts like loitering or drinking in public or peeing on the street. These were not people who were ever actually people who were arrested for violent offenses or harm were sent to the county jail, which was run separately than the city jail. I mention this because it comes into play. 23 years after the Olympics, the city council voted 11-1 on a resolution to close the jail and to repurpose and reimagine it as a site for a center for equity, wellness, and equality. So they weren't just saying like, let's close it down and then sell the land's office building. They said, what can we do to start making this a site where we start to repair some of the damage that these decades have done? This did not happen because the city politicians decided that a jail wasn't necessary, but because of the years of organizing to not only close the physical jail buildings, the behemoth that towered over all the surrounding buildings, but also to render the supposed necessity for obsolete. And the people who were organizing to close the jail, or what they called starve the beast, included women who had once upon a time spent time in that very jail and understood that the building and the resources being poured into it would be better spent on supports that would keep people out of jail in their homes and perhaps doing even better in their communities. So they organized, and some of that organizing looked like ways in which they would start whittling away at some of the laws and policies that sent people to that jail. The jail cost $32.5 million a year to operate, and usually held fewer than 100 people. So this is also like, why would we spend that much money on this behemoth? You know, and really not for any reason at all. And what the campaigners did was they challenged the city's use of these millions of dollars each year, asking community, how can we spend our city's resources? And they engaged in campaigns to render the jail obsolete, including things like something called ban the box. I don't know if you have this in the UK, where when you apply for a job, there's on the job application, like you apply to like work at the supermarket or, you know, something else. There's that box that says, like, you know, like check here if you have an arrest or a conviction. And in the United States, there's a growing movement in various cities and states to ban the box, so that way a potential employer doesn't see that you check the box. So they launched a campaign to ban the box, and they won that campaign in 2014, several years before the jail closed. They formed a pre-arrest diversion initiative, which redirected people out of jail and the criminal legal system, you know, into community alternatives, which would look like not probation, not parole, not electronic monitoring or tagging, as you call it, but, you know, like, what do you need to actually address whatever the, you know, whatever, whether it might be like, hey, you might need some mental health support. Hey, you might need some drug treatment. Hey, you were just caught peeing on the street because you actually don't have a home. What can we do to like help you navigate the house or, you know, find a place to stay? So you have a toilet to fix, and you don't get arrested for this. They also pushed for marijuana decriminalization, which they won in 2017. So that was another way to starve the beast of people going in. They fought and won the elimination of cash bail, which is money that you pay to secure your freedom while you're awaiting trial, for people who are charged with nonviolent misdemeanors or violating city ordinances. They successfully fought to end the contract with immigration services so that immigrants would no longer be held in jail. And these were all ways in which they were able to lead up to that 2019 resolution to close the jails. Say, look, you're not putting so many people in. We're putting fewer people in. Look, you don't even need this building anymore. You don't need that 32.5. And I bring this up as an example of the organizing. And again, remember, most of it was led by formerly incarcerated women, not simply to demand that jail conditions improve, which is a demand that sometimes results in prison systems demanding more money so that they can improve themselves, but actually demanding that the jail itself staff. And I bring this up because here in Scotland, the prison at HMP Barlinnie is slated to be closed, but instead of saying, who can we release? How do we shrink the population? How do we let people go home with supports that enable them to go home and stay in the community? But instead they're talking about building another prison of the same site, the same size, same number of people engaged inside. So I bring this up to ask you a question: what types of campaigns would be needed to start things here? And then, as a cautionary postscript note, unfortunately, 4 years after the Atlanta City government worked to close the jail, the pandemic hit and everything else, it not only has remained open, but has been repurposed from this intended transformation from a center for wellness and equity into the new Fulton County Jail, to address the fact that other jail is falling apart and is falling apart. So that is another cautionary lesson to take is they did tremendous organizing. And then another just like, hey, we need that building, you know, so for our overflow. So I started with that story. I wanted to draw some comparisons in Scotland, which has one of the highest, the highest incarceration rate in Europe, though it's still a relatively small number of people, to the US, which is the world's incarceration. So Scotland has approximately 5.5 million people, and 138 of every 100,000 people are incarcerated in this country. In comparison, the United States locks up 531 of every. So it is still shocking, you know, number. And in the US, that comes out to more than 2 million people behind bars, not including people who are in migrant detention, which is considered a different type of imprisonment or not prison at all. People in juvenile prison or people in lockdown. I'm from New York City, and my home state of New York, with a population of nearly 20 million, locks up 376 of every 100,000 people, or double the rate of Scotland. And New York state prisons confine more than 30,000 people per month. Now, because a lot of my work looks at what happens to women behind bars, because often they are often the neglected subject when we talk about imprisonment. People tend to look at imprisonment as a male issue, or if they think about it as gender neutral, they don't think of, you know, some of the ways in which incarceration specifically impacts women. So in the incarceration rates for women in the United States, 133 of every 100,000 women are incarcerated. In my lovely home state of New York, 57 of 100,000 every 100,000 women are behind bars. And in the UK itself, 13 of every 100,000. It's not a lot, technically speaking, but we have to remember that each of these numbers represents people. And in Scotland, about 4% of the population are women, but the number of women on remand has risen to 36%, of more than 1/3 of the jail population. So keep that in mind too. So that is a huge number of women being torn from their families, communities. And those of you who have women in your family know that women are oftentimes the linchpin of the family, whether they are mothers, sisters, daughters, or, you know, so keep that in mind too. And keep in mind that these figures do not include trans women who are held in managed jails or prisons. The latest number I could find for trans women was 2017. I don't know if anybody has any other more recent numbers, in which the UK government counted 17 trans women incarcerated in Scotland and 125. The US does not keep any record counts. So your guess is as good as mine to how many trans women are incarcerated in the US. And despite the fact that Scotland and the UK overall incarcerate far fewer women and people altogether than the United States, there are still striking similarities between. Now I'm going to take 7 minutes to make you do this exercise. So what do you think of when you think of women in prison? Just shout out things, you know, like what do you like, what are some of the issues, who goes to prison?
Drug addiction.
Yes, drug addiction and drug criminalization as well. That is one of the things that the US and other countries share as to, you know, what happens for women in prison.
Lack of accessible mental health services.
Yes, lack of accessible mental health services. Mental health services in the United States are abysmal. The United States does not have any sort of guaranteed health care, or mental health care. So, and it is extremely difficult to access these services in the United States. And I understand it's very difficult to access these services. And I learned today it is also very difficult, even though there's the NHS, to access these services in Scotland and as well. Other
victims of domestic abuse.
Yes, victims of domestic abuse. In the UK, 46% of women in prison reported having experienced domestic abuse before their arrest and incarceration. And in the United States, at least half of all women in prison have reported this as well. And when we think about domestic abuse or domestic violence or family violence, one of the things you should understand is that people are very reluctant to disclose. They have been taught again and again and again quiet about their experiences of violence. They've been taught again and again that nobody will believe them, that if they tell, there will be serious repercussions. So by the time they get to prison and they're talking to the intake officer who has a clipboard or like a computer checklist, they're not going to tell them. They're far less likely to disclose that they have experienced domestic abuse or violence. So we can surmise that these numbers are much, much higher. And women in custody throughout the years told me again and again and again, they have never met, like, all of their years, collective years of incarceration, any woman who has not experienced domestic or family violence before. So they were like, yeah, 50% that's it. Everybody knows experience. Like everybody knows experience. Other issues that come to mind when you think of yes, mothers in prison. Here in the UK, at least 1/5 of incarcerated women are single parents before incarceration. In the US, at least 2/3 of women in prison were also parents of children under the age of 18 before their arrest. And over half of those, somebody's a math was made, but 2/3 of, and half 2/3 equals, before their arrest. And this is hugely important, again, because of the way Western society genders family, where much of the caregiving falls on people who are classified as who are mothers. And in the US, this often looks like when a mom gets arrested, children are 5 times more likely to end up in the foster care system than when a father is arrested and he has female relatives, wife, ex-wife, girlfriend, ex-girlfriend, cousin, mother, sister, somebody will step up to take care of the children. Whereas women oftentimes are already single heads of household, or they have, or their spouse or co-parent is arrested alongside them, or their spouse or co-parent cannot or does not want to single parent the child, or their spouse, co-parent, or families are not safe to take care of their children. Again, remembering that so many people have reported past experiences. And then here's what's true in both countries is that approximately half of mothers in both the UK and in the US have reported never receiving a visit from their child since their incarceration. And maintaining contact is often made much more difficult by the distance from the communities the prisons dispense, and the fact that we go through dehumanizing, humiliating processes to visit someone in the prison. I don't know if you have all the same individuals when you go visit a loved one in a Scottish prison in the US, but in the US, it is seems as if it is designed to deter people from visiting their loved ones. And many people choose not to continue to go through this. Other issues that you can know. Yes.
Lots of people being sentenced for petty crimes and crimes of survival.
Yes, people being sentenced for petty crimes and crimes of survival. So not harm or violence or things that threaten other people. In the UK, most women entering prison who have been sentenced, about 84%, have committed either a non-violent offense or theft. And that, hold on. Like my numbers don't make sense. Anyhow, so women entering prison under sentence committed a nonviolent offense or a theft offense. And that was about 84% in 2016. In the US, women who are convicted of nonviolent offenses, including habitual offenses or drug offenses, make up about 2/3 of the prison. So this is also a huge number of people who have not directly harmed somebody else. They didn't go punch somebody's legs off again and again and again. It's like these are things that are not harming. Other things you can think of.
Sexual violence.
Yes, sexual violence. Huge numbers of incarcerated women have reported experience sexual violence before coming to prison, including both childhood and adults, including abuse when they were children and when they were not that they. And then prisons perpetuate the same type of sexual violence, even if you were never sexually assaulted in prison. Just the daily indignities, like having to be strip searched before and after, going to any outside appointment, like a court appointment or a medical visit, or in the US, people are strip searched before and after visiting, visits with their children, or visits with family members. So some women have actually said it is so re-traumatizing and triggering to have to go through strip searches, they would rather not see their children. And remember, over approximately half of mothers already don't see their children. And so this just adds to. Yes, disproportionately incarcerated for the women of color. In the US, women of color, Black women are, I forget what it is, 3 times or something like that, more likely to be incarcerated, or are incarcerated at a rate 3 times more than their white counterparts. Latinx women are incarcerated nearly twice the rate of their white counterparts, and we don't know of other races nationwide because nobody models statistics. I think in Oklahoma, the incarceration rate for Native women is super sky high compared to their numbers in the state, but Oklahoma is an outlier. I don't know about the UK, what the racial makeup was. We were at a post custody unit yesterday, and I was actually shocked that everybody appeared to be white because I've been to many prisons in the US, even in these very white places. I'm like, wow, there are only 2 Black people in this whole area, and you managed to lock them both up. And so I actually thought there's no one. There's no one, so I don't know what the racial makeup is in Scotland itself of the prison population, but I don't say racialized people are more likely to be arrested. Other things. Poverty. Yes. People who are arrested and end up in prison are more likely to be in poverty or near the poverty line than people who have never been to get entangled. And people who have money can also afford things like in the US making bail, which is one of the things that heightens your chance at not going to prison. Is if you can fight your case on the outside, they're able to access better legal help. There's all sorts of things that end up making it less likely that a person will not go to prison.
It's not quite in the same direction, but I also think that there's this creative and resilient.
Yes. I don't want to just say like these are all victims, sitting inside prisons, but at the same time, there's a whole bunch of forces that, say like we're shoving certain marginalized people into these prisons, and after having had systems that failed. Not that people think of. Yes, lack of access to gendered healthcare, and in the US, lack of access to healthcare generally. Not to say that men having a great time at healthcare, because they are not. But in the United States, interestingly enough, incarcerated people are the only ones with a constitutional right to healthcare under the 8th Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. So, but the Supreme Court did not say what kind of healthcare or what level of healthcare they're supposed to get. They just says, thou shalt provide healthcare to incarcerated people because to not do so violated. And there have been numerous lawsuits that show again and again and again that this idea of access to healthcare is not taken seriously by jail and prison administrators. And then when you think of the abysmal level of healthcare people get in jails and prisons, and then you add on gendered healthcare or reproductive healthcare, then it gets even further. And then if you add on trans-specific healthcare, it gets even further, and the stress is going further. So yes, so healthcare is abysmal, and then you add on the complications and nuances of people's genders and gender identities, and your healthcare is just inconsistent. And one of the things too in the U.S. is pregnancy, which an estimated 5% of women in jails and 4% of women in prisons are pregnant when they enter. Some are in jails because people tend to be in jail so long that they give birth before they go to prison. And for the longest time, and still in more than 10 or 15 states, prisons allowed the shackling of pregnant women even during labor and delivery. So for those of you who need a visual, imagine being handcuffed, and then having a chain from your handcuffs that goes to a belly chain. So if you who ride bikes, if you think of your bike chain, that's not how heavy it is. And then you have another chain that leads to your ankles, which are pumped together. And then many states have what they call a black box, which is a little box here. So you can pull the handcuffs here so that you're walking, so you can't keep your hands out to say you fall or need something. And then you were led around like this. And for many, many, many decades, there was no prohibition that said, "Thou shalt not shackle a woman in labor and delivery." And it was not until 1999 that Illinois became the first state to pass a law that says what everybody should think is common sense, which is don't shackle women in labor and delivery. And other states slowly followed suit. And now 30 states have some law. The United States is 50 states. So there's still 20 that actually don't have a law or a policy that says don't do this. So which means that women who are in labor and delivery are still faced with this this atrocity of being shot while they are in labor and being transported to that. In the UK, from what I understand, no government agency collects the numbers of women in custody. Somebody please correct me if I am wrong. But I did find that between 2013 and 2018, there were 104 pregnant women in a Scottish jail. 37 of them were serving sentences of less than 12 months. So you think, why would you need to even make them go spend their pregnancies behind bars? If they're considered so not dangerous that they're in prison for less than 12 months, and 31 of them gave birth while and I found a 2021 article in the Scotsman, maybe many of you have read it, about an 18-year-old pregnant woman whom they call Miss A, who is in a prison called Bronx, which calls itself a dynamic and forward-thinking women's prison. I don't know anything about it. I do not know if it is dynamic and forward-thinking, but her experience shows that perhaps it is not. When she went into labor, she called for help and the staff ignored her, and she ended up having the baby on her. By the time the staff actually bothered to check on her, the baby was dead, and no one knew if the baby had died before or after. The inquiry that followed said that the staff showed little professional curiosity about why this woman wouldn't engage with them, and showed that her care was inflexible, unimaginative, and insufficiently trauma-informed. The staff saw her as difficult and with a bad attitude. And the prison website, which boasted it has a mother-baby unit, noted that its outcomes are good for women in all countries. So, I mean, if you think about this, it's like, why did she need to be in prison? What was happening? So she was difficult and had a bad attitude, but that should not have meant that she was left by herself to give birth.
Just on this, I recently found out that a girl in prison for Vermont in Scotland, even if you're pregnant and released to like zero money, they're just being given with the pregnancy back. So you could be 9 months pregnant and they release you to be work. There's no regulation.
So that is like piggybacking on the like lack of productivity. And so going back to mothers, and I will like end this, or a more resistant note. We talked about the fact that there are so many mothers in prison, both in the U.S. and the UK. This also dovetails into what you said about releasing pregnant women from jails, to think their baby. We know that parents are together. Sorry, I'm sort of like scrolling through my notes to shorten this up. And in the United States, the recognition that there are so many mothers in prison and that women and people are pregnant when they enter jails and prisons has sometimes led to calls for the creation of more programs that expand prison. This includes things like prison nurseries. In the United States, there are, I believe, 7 or 9 states that have prison nursery programs in which incarcerated women who are pregnant can apply, and they have to be approved, to be in the prison nursery with their babies for anywhere from 6 to 18 months, depending on the prison. The criteria in many places is very strict, and it is up to the superintendent, or I guess what you would call a warden, to approve or disapprove. They can be kicked out at any time. And it is often used as a lever of control. And the people who are often approved are the people who are deemed not security threats. So you have to ask yourself, if you are not a security threat, why should you want to be in a prison with your baby where you have to stand up 5 times a day to get counted? I don't know if we have this in the UK. Count in the US is literally when everybody's got to stop, be at their bedside or their cell door, and a guard comes by. 1, 2, 3, 4, and for an hour or more, everything in the prison stops so that they can count each person to make sure that nobody's escaped. So you can imagine if you're in prison with 500 or more people, this is a very lengthy affair. And God forbid somebody miscounts, then you'll be standing there another. And this has also led sometimes to this idea that we should have locked in the US these mother baby institutions that are alternatives to incarceration but are still locked down. I talk about one of them in Prison by Any Other Name, where basically you are still in a locked unit, but it is not considered part of the prison. But you are still not allowed. You can't go out. You can't, take your baby. You can't, or you can only go out if you pass and it's been approved. If you have older children, both in prison nurseries and in these lockdown institutions, they cannot come and live with you. So if you're pregnant and you have a 5-year-old at home, the 5-year-old does not get to. Maybe the baby can, stay with you. But the 5-year-old has to live with grandma or, dad or uncle or in foster care, and that's just the way it is. And neither prison nursery programs nor these lockdown mother baby units address any underlying causes of criminalization. Or doesn't address poverty, it doesn't address mental health issues. It doesn't address the fact that we've got all these laws that penalize marginalized people, disproportionately, at least incarcerate them. But there have also been efforts, and in the United States, I forgot to tell you this earlier, we have this terrible law called the Federal Adopted and Safe Families Act, which states that if a child's been in foster care for 15 months, a judge has to start, the state has to start termination proceedings to terminate a person's parental rights. And given that a disproportionate, mothers are more likely to have children in care than fathers, this affects incarcerated mothers. And only 2 states actually had any sort of consideration for whether or not it was because a mother or a parent was incarcerated. In the 48 other states, that meant that if you're sentenced to 20 months, it was 36 months, it was 40 months, you did not have your child. And in the United States, termination of parental rights means they're gone. You don't get to come home and be like, I would like to reapply to my rights. You have no more rights to any information about your child than the stranger in your house. And what happens in various women's prisons and from women coming home was they said, you know what, we're going to organize this. And so they started organizing, first they started organizing know your rights shops with each other in this. Said, here are what your rights are as an incarcerated parent, the foster family, or the social worker has to bring your child up, every so often. And this is what you do if they this is how to find out when your family court date is. So that way you can get to family court and show up and say, Judge, I'm still terminating parental rights because I'm frustrated because I get out, next year, or look, I can show you that I've been involved with my child. And then they decided to take it a step further and said, well, challenge this law, or at least the mechanism in the press clause. And in New York, that resulted in something called the ASPA expanded discretion, which does not get rid of the law, but allows parents to go to court and say, I want to press pause. You have to press pause. You can't consider my incarceration as part of the teen timeline because my kid's in and this happened because of the organizing of currently and formerly incarcerated parents, mostly mothers, who had either raised their children in the foster care system or been very close to losing their children in the foster care system. And it took over 10 years of organizing. Women on the inside wrote letters and cards and shared their stories of nearly losing or actually losing their children. Some of their children got involved in lobby days. They went to lawmakers and they said, this was not part of my court sentence. The court sentence wasn't prison and you don't parent anymore. The court sentence was prison. And they won that in 2010. Inspired by that, incarcerated parents in Washington State said, we're going to do that too. And they passed a similar law a couple of years later that then did that. And then in Massachusetts and in Tennessee and several other states, but Massachusetts first, said, let's take this a step further and let's lobby for a primary caregivers act, which says that if you are a primary caregiver and you are facing a prison sentence, you can petition the judge to say, look, I'm a primary caregiver of 2 young children, or 1 young child. Please sentence me to something that is not prison, so that I can be home with my child and I can caregive for my child, and they will not end up in the foster care system. You will not wreck our relationship. And in 2018, they won that with some pardons. So the 2018 law is perfect. It said that you have to be, you can only apply if you're convicted of a non-violent offense. So these have to go to assault or murder or other things. But it also states that if a judge decides not to grant your request for a non-prison sentence, they have to give a written explanation as to why. So they don't just get to check off the boxes and nah, go to prison. They actually have to say, in my opinion, it is in purpose. And then followed by that, Tennessee passes it up. Incarcerated and formerly incarcerated mothers in Tennessee managed to have similar following. So I want to stress this is not, as you said, these are people who are creative and resilient and figured out a way to channel that creativity and resilience. How do we make this so that nobody else has to do this? And I want to emphasize again that these are campaigns that were led by directly impacted people, mostly women, mostly mothers, and they not only share their stories with lawmakers, media, but also use their experiences to help shape policy so that others coming up after them, as you know, this keeps going on, we're not going to suffer all of these big collapses. And I'm just going to end by noting that this past Saturday was the 10th anniversary of the mass prison hunger strikes in California that ended the practice of indefinite solitary confinement that California had been practicing for decades upon decades. And we had started, you know, our morning with Martha's recounting of the Peterhead prison protests on solitary confinement. So I wanted to remind people that sometimes change comes super slow, but you know, like sometimes it seems like just plugging along and nothing happens. And then sometimes things happen and you look back and we're like, wow, we did that. We ended indefinite solitary confinement. Or, oh, we did this. We ended the automatic tearing apart of families. Oh, we did that. We don't have to be shackled while they're in labor, giving birth or right after. So please keep in mind that as we move forward, it's not just that the peace keeps grinding down, but people find ways to resist and organize and change and challenge these people. Thank you.
So if anyone has questions? You don't have the money, so
So I've got this a couple online, so I can start there while you could think and perhaps some, and then if you want to check it out, whiz around. The first one came from Cara, who said, that was fascinating. How did you come to this work?
Okay, I'll try to give the very short version. So I grew up in New York City. I grew up at a time in which you just went to the high school that you were zoned for. So if you lived in a certain place, you went to a certain high school. I went to the high school that was mostly Black, brown, and immigrant. It was pretty much all Black, brown, and immigrant. There were, you know, a few thousand kids. 2 of them are white. So yeah. And it was totally under-resourced, and it was over-policed. The first thing you did every morning is you put your bag to one of those like X-ray machines, and you went through a medical test. There were, I think it was something like 4,000 kids in the school. You know, the teachers did the best they could, but if you have overcrowded classrooms, there's only so much you can do. And it was a perfect recruiting ground for gangs. And a lot of my friends in high school joined gangs, dropped out of high school, got arrested for gang-related activity, and got sent to Rikers Island, which in New York is an entire island devoted to jails. There are 10 jails at Rikers. It used to be 11, and one of the buildings got closed because, yeah, you know, hazard. Not because they just Brandeis jail, it's the closest jails. And that was what got me started with looking at jails and prisons, because suddenly this was a reality in my life. Oh, where did my friends go? Oh, they went to jail. You know, oh, okay. What is it? And so I started reading about it, learning about it, and everything that I read was reflected in every single time I went to go visit them. You know, it was mostly Black, brown, and immigrant poor. It was people who were arrested not for mass murder or mass mayhem, but because they had addiction issues, because they just couldn't catch a break again and again and again. So everything just reinforces.
A question here? Yeah, go for it.
Thanks so much. And what would you say to the argument that what we need are and our reforms presidents maybe with much smaller populations rather than
I think that you can argue that, you know, you need reformed prisons, but why do you need, like, I would argue back, who would these reformed prisons be for? And is prison actually what you know, what people do to survive and thrive? If you're going to have these much smaller things, why not just have it be a community resource with, you know, like more supports for people? Because it costs money to run prisons, you know, like, and so why are you, like, it costs $32.5 million a year to incarcerate fewer than 100 people at any given time. Like, prisons just suck up all the resources. Like, how much more housing would you build? How many more mental health clinicians that are not punitive mental health clinicians, but people who can sit and take the time to sit and listen and assess, not just be like, you take this drug, you take that drug, next. You know, what other resources do people in communities need in order to survive and thrive and not have violence and equity on them all the time. Earlier today, we did an activity, like a science fiction activity, like what would we want, instead of prisons? And people were like, food, food for everyone, housing for everyone, mental health services, time to rest and relax. What would you do with $32.5 million a year? I'm sure you can get a lot of that done. So when people say, like, what about smaller prisons? It's like, why would we pour our resources into building smaller prisons instead of saying, what are the support we need and how do we do this in a way that benefits them, benefits the entire community as well?
Yeah, go for it. Kind of related to that. It's going to find things that problem because something that was studied emerging struggle with a bit at the moment is what you do if you have a little bit of confusion or conflict when you felt about the difference between petty crime and like still recognize lots of petty crime that take place that's very circumstantial and but then actually that is also like bad crime people with very violent and like for example like there's sexual assault that subjected to and things like that. Like once they think someone with an evil unreformable because they've done that. But in that
I mean, one of the things that, I say in prisons make us safer, is that if prisons made us safer, the United States with this giant incarceration rate should be like, we have no rapes, we have no sexual assaults, we have no murders, we have no mass shootings, we should be the safest nation. We should be walking the United States, like, the beacon of safety. And instead what we see is that prisons have not, they have not stopped murders, they have not stopped, assaults, they've definitely not stopped mass shootings, so, so say like, yes, the existence of police in prisons, the threat of police in prisons does not make people safer. The FBI does these victim surveys, and they found that actually something like 50 or 52% of people who have experienced violent crime, which reported to the FBI, actually never reported to law enforcement. So I mean, so right there, that shows you that people who have been victimized by violence don't think that law enforcement will do anything for them or make them safer or solve their problems. So I think that the thing to do is to say, like, yes, we understand harm happens, but harm is happening now. And I assume that Scotland also is not rape, murder, and assault free. Maybe you're mass shooting, which could be. But but the existence of prisons and your high incarceration does not stop any of this from happening. So like saying, we need to keep investing in the system that has failed to stop these harms from happening, instead of saying, why don't we start looking at other solutions? Why does it need to be a tried and true solution that's just, without having put millions of dollars in? Like you're like, oh, let's try this thing. Oh, well, you didn't put $32.5 million into it. We're always supposed to know if it works.
Yeah, so if we go 1, 2, 3, and then I will take Paul and Charlotte. So, yeah, so 1, 2. Yes, you first. Sorry.
Yeah, it's really interesting about all the kind of like constellations of campaigns and resistance around the content and also like campaigns that we were involved in you had been in prison, and you said that like the pushback against it not being about community sentences like probation, etc. And like can you talk more about the tension between these two things, and like how would you like divert investment and energy that goes into all these things so the next like cash.
In the United States, probation and probation is part of the criminal justice. It's still the same agency or forces that oversee it. And in the US, probation is often what I call a slip and slide, and then you end up in prison because it comes with a whole onerous host of requirements and regulations from things like curfews. Think about like a time that you were like, yeah, I'll be home at 8, and you like scroll in. That would be cause for being sent back to prison. Missing an appointment, being late to a meeting, failing a drug test, multiple you know, failing to like tell your probation officer that you changed adversaries, or, you know, people get housing very quickly, you know, something that is unsafe. Losing your job, not having a job, not going to all of these required classes they make you take in the middle of a work day, you know, that maybe you aren't able to get to. So there's a whole host of requirements that come with it. That, you know, failing one of them is not criminal offense. It is not a violent, harmful offense. But in the eyes of the probation officer, that is the grounds for sentence. And then you end up in this cycle of being like, okay, well now, or even if you are not sent to prison, you're in jail, and suddenly now you're going to you know, suddenly your child is in foster care because you failed to pick them up at school because you got arrested when you went to check with your probation officer and they noticed that you and your child in foster care. So it's still this punitive mindset, and probation in the United States is not helping navigate any of the things like housing, finding childcare, you know, helping you to find a living wage job, figure out like health insurance or, you know, the healthcare system. It is just come check in, and did you do all these things that we told you to do this week? And if you did not, you have grounds to say that you find your you can get fined. So, so community alternatives would actually be like, what do you need in order? If somebody says like, you know, I'm really struggling with housing, it might be like, you know, what housing agencies do we partner with that we can refer you to? So you're not just standing in line, you know, to name those agencies, but it's like, hey, we partner with Housing First, maybe, you know, like, let's take a look at an appointment with somebody over there, and they can get it.
In kind of context, not before this or before these measures, is argue that it still improves some of the old structures that we like to see changed to another sentence. So what's do you think sort of justice practice? Some people would argue that it still confirms, you know, structures that we want to see changed. Like maybe a routine service is punishment. But does it any good to change businesses or anything else?
I mean, I have a couple of thoughts on this. You know, one is in the United States, there's different types of restorative justice. Like restorative justice is being co-opted by some places, by some legal system actors. So some restorative justice is still like courtroom, which is not actually restorative justice. Some prisons have co-opted this to say like, we're doing a restorative justice process, which doesn't actually keep anybody out of prison or address underlying factors, but it's something that looks nice. But if you're talking about restorative justice in which different parties, you know, go through a process in which, you know, the person who was harmed, you know, or AKA the victim, is supported by people and getting the help that they need, and to ask, what do you need from you? Not just what do you want to happen to that person? Because they might be like, I want to finish their lives out, you know, like, and like, and then I have a crime 10 times. But, you know, it might be like, what do you need? And they might be, you know what? I've got this $2,700 hospital bill because I have to go to the hospital. I need help. You know, and you know, like I'm going to I need counseling now because, you know, I have I have PTSD from having been attacked. You know, like these are the things I need, and having people that help me figure this out. And on this side, there's the person who did the harm, and having a team there that's like, why did you do what you did? What triggered this, right? Like, what are the factors? Because we know that harm doesn't come out. There's like a buildup of things that are not always visible. What needs to happen so that this doesn't happen again? And what needs to happen so that the person who's harmed can then maybe eventually like tell the person who harmed them, this is what I and it is a slower process than just like picking up the phone, calling the police, going to the prosecutor's office, you know, and reciting your story and making testifying, which are, you know, like but it's a much more involved process. But I would argue that this is something where people's needs are met, you know, and it keeps people out of a punitive system in which nobody's needs are met, because people who have been harmed with the police often find that that's it. Great, thanks for testifying. And it's like, well, this $2,700 hospital bill I have, the need for therapy, and the fact that I can't go out at night because I'm so scared. Yeah, it's on you. So having, you know, something in place that does that, you know. So even if you would say it's not a perfect solution, it, you know, like it starts whittling away at this, and it also gives us an idea of like what else. You know, can it be misused? Yes, but guess what? Policing in prisons has been misused quite, you know, so often that it's like that one would think, you know, institution. But it also gives us space to say like what else is possible, you know, like what else can happen if we're looking at a restorative justice program. Like what else can, you know, can we do to make sure that we're working towards a future in which we don't need to rely on these carceral punitive systems.
There's one last question. Yes. So often when I frequent vision, I'm probably made with how people are very much connected to certain elements of our society. All of which is a control, logic, control views, content, capitalism. And in this conversation, we're often getting stuck when can prison actually be abolished or abolishing all these modern aspects of the cost especially like thinking that maybe certain reforms, the improved prison, actually make the one of abolishing the part of the way to improve prison. Like it in a way makes the final aim of abolition. So I was wondering, so I mean, I still don't have numbers that we come with that. And can prison be abolished right now? How we work now? And I was wondering, what do you think we can do to have this conflict? And back to the world?
Well, I think that one of the things that I look at is I think it was Andre Gortz that first used the term non-repetition reform. Actually, I don't know what Andre Gortz is. I learned about this through Wilson Gilman. So like, you know, where it's basically like if you're looking at a reform, you ask yourself, does this make the treatment system stronger? Like prison nursery, right? Does this put more resources in the prison? Does it make it seem nicer and gentler and more humane and more palatable for the general public? Then it is a reformist, you know. But you could ask, like, does it address the need that needs to be addressed now, like shackling pregnant women or pregnant people when they're in labor and delivery, which is a very low benchmark. I mean, really, like, you know, if we're starting there, it's very sad. But you know, like, you can't say to, you know, the 5% of, you know, 200,000 women, somebody did that, please. Just wait until we abolish prisons before you have that baby, you know, and then you won't be shackled while you're in labor and delivery. But so that would be a non-conformist reform, saying like, no, your guards cannot take out the handcuffs and the belly chain and the black box and the ankle shackles and do this when they are transporting somebody to the hospital with the baby. So that's like a non-reformist reform wait for an immediacy, or ending indefinite solitary confinement so that people don't spend a year, 5 years, 10 years. There's a documentary that just came out on Al Jazeera. A man who spent 27 years and counting in Texas in solitary. So you could say like having policies that are like you cannot put somebody in solitary confinement, which is, you know, is right here, you know, all by themselves for 27 years. So I think while fighting towards abolition, say like, how do we shrink prisons and the need for it, and bolstering the resources, of course, we need outside. How do we also say like, cannot torture people in that same way? So we're not telling a guy who's in solitary confinement for 27 years. Just hang out there, you know, a few years more, like maybe bigger this. So I think that there is that tension. So I think one of the things that I've always found valuable to say, is this a reformist reform that puts more resources in the prisons? Like, let's build a mother baby unit. Let's build, you know, like a mental health ward in the prisons. Let's, you know, put more resources into body cameras for guards that can turn off at any given time. Or, you know, is this a non-reformist reform? It's like, we understand that there's many people in prison now who are undergoing these kinds of tortures, and how do we end these tortures, you know, so that way you don't end up, you know, with people who've been, you know, tortured to different insanity, or even just the terrible inhumanities, you know, while also saying like, you should not have institutions.
I'm conscious of time, so if you're in the room, you'll be able to have a chance to grab it afterwards. You know, that burning question you didn't get to ask. But Shell is online, and so I'll give her the last question, which was, what are the best ways to support organizing by incarcerated people?
I think finding organizations that work with incarcerated people and or their family members, because some organizations may not be able to work directly with incarcerated people because prisons place many barriers on applications, you know, like in their ability to like, you know, get their voices out or visited. But then there are also people who have reached family members, their family members, you know, are the ones that are fighting outside, you know, for their loved ones. The California hunger strike that I ended with, family members really stepped up, you know, like, and they became the faces of the hunger strikers, because California law policy does not allow media representatives to be like, I want to interview that person, to go in with a camera. So they could not interview people directly, but they could interview their moms, they could interview their wives, they could interview their sisters and their other loved ones, who would then pull pictures of their loved ones, be like, you know, like on camera, be like, this is my brother, you know, Donnie, he's been in solitary for the and you know, like, he used to be, you know, like a really dark brown, and now this is like a weird misty color because he hasn't seen sunlight, you know. And it's like, but having those types of, you know, so finding organizations that work directly with people who are directly impacted, you know, and I'm sure there are some in
Families Outside, if you don't know, it's an amazing organization. They've been working for decades in Scotland to support families of people in custody, and they've got a great website and everything. So if you're interested in learning more about Families Outside, it's a great organization.
I think that is us for time.
Okay.
So we will have a little bit of chance for signing if you've already got your book. We only have a few left from the end of our workshop day. So if there aren't enough books to go around, then feel free to put down your name. We have more that are on the way from the States. But that leaves me only to ask you to join me in giving Victoria a very big thank you.